The ballroom of the Thorn Empire's flagship hotel gleamed with opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting warm light over an ocean of guests in designer gowns and tailored suits. Tables were adorned with towering floral arrangements, their fragrance blending with the aroma of champagne and gourmet hors d'oeuvres. The room was alive with laughter and chatter, a symphony of wealth and influence. Everett Thorne stood near the bar, clutching a glass of sparkling water. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, as it always did, and his golden cufflinks caught the light each time he moved. Yet, he felt suffocated. It wasn't the crowd or the grandeur. He had grown up in such environments, but the weight of expectations pressing down on him like an anchor. His mother's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and commanding. "Everett, darling, it's time." He turned to face Coraline Thorne, who looked every bit the matriarch of an empire. Her icy blue eyes scanned him critically, ensuring every detail of his appearance met her exacting standards. She placed a perfectly manicured hand on his arm and leaned in, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You'll make the announcement tonight. The Calder family is expecting it." Everett's jaw tightened. He glanced across the room to where Rowena Calder, his fiancée-to-be, stood among a cluster of guests. She was poised and elegant, smiling politely at something a guest was saying. To everyone else, they were the perfect match, two heirs merging their empires in a union that promised even greater wealth and power. But to Everett, the idea felt hollow. He swallowed his frustration and nodded. "Of course, Mother." Coraline's smile was cold and triumphant. She patted his arm before sweeping away to mingle with the guests, leaving Everett alone with his thoughts. He exhaled slowly, scanning the room as he prepared himself for the inevitable performance. It was then that he noticed her, a young woman in a simple black server's uniform standing near the dessert table. She was out of place, not because of her attire, but because of the way she carried herself. She wasn't trying to blend in. Everett watched as she laughed at a minor mishap, a spilled tray of drinks that narrowly missed her. She didn't seem embarrassed or flustered, just amused, her laughter a burst of authenticity in a room full of rehearsed smiles. He found himself smiling, too, despite himself. For a fleeting moment, the suffocating grandeur of the party faded into the background. Who was she? The question lingered in his mind, as the weight of his responsibilities loomed large once again. The heels of Marlo Reed's black flats clicked softly against the polished marble floor as she made her way to the service hallway. The grandeur of the ballroom, with its glittering chandeliers and polished guests, was already fading into the background. She loosened the bobby pins that had kept her hair tightly secured for the evening, sighing as the faint tension in her scalp eased. This wasn't the life she'd imagined when she packed her suitcase and left Eldermere, a sleepy Midwestern town where dreams often died before they could take root. But she hadn't come to Los Angeles for luxury or adventure. She came for answers. Marlo's fingers brushed against the pocket of her apron, where the edges of weathered envelopes pressed faintly against the fabric. The bundle of letters, tied together with a fraying ribbon, was the only link she had to the father she'd never known. Her grandmother had given them to her weeks before she passed, the guilt heavy in her voice. "I should have told you sooner," she'd said. "But he's not a bad man, Marlo. He loved you in his own way." The letters had been written in careful, deliberate handwriting, filled with vague references to a man trying to make amends. The most recent one, dated nearly 2 decades ago, had mentioned Los Angeles. It wasn't much to go on, but it was enough to give her hope. Yet, hope didn't pay the bills. Marlo adjusted her bag over her shoulder and glanced at the paycheck she'd just picked up from the manager's office. It wasn't much, but it would keep her going for another week or two. Her stomach twisted as she thought about the mounting rent and the part-time shifts that barely made ends meet. As she pushed open the staff exit, the cool night air hit her skin, a welcome reprieve from the stifling warmth of the party. She stopped short when she heard voices nearby, low and sharp. Peering around the corner, she recognized the commanding tone of Coraline Thorne. "Ensure it's handled quietly. We can't risk the board finding out." Marlo held her breath, straining to hear more, but Coraline's voice dropped further as the conversation moved away. Still, the words stuck with her like a splinter, sharp and out of place. What couldn't the board find out? As she walked home under the city's neon glow, the weight of her curiosity mingled with the ever-present burden of her struggles. The cafe inside the Thorn Empire's main hotel was immaculate, a carefully curated mix of modern elegance and classic charm. Floor-to-ceiling windows let in the golden morning light, casting a soft glow over the pristine white tablecloths and freshly arranged flowers. Everett Thorne sat at a table near the window, his gaze drifting to the street below. He envied the passers-by, ordinary people moving through their lives with freedom, untouched by the weight of legacy and expectations. Everett, Rowena Calder's voice cut through his thoughts, crisp and polite as ever. She arrived with a practiced smile, her sleek designer dress perfectly tailored to match her composed demeanor. She kissed him lightly on the cheek before sitting down, her movements precise and deliberate. "I took the liberty of ordering for us," she said, sliding into her seat. "The chef recommended the truffle omelet." Everett nodded absently, folding his hands on the table. "Sounds fine." Rowena tilted her head, studying him with a mix of amusement and mild exasperation. "You've been distracted lately. Is everything all right?" "I'm fine," he replied, though the tightness in his voice betrayed him. "Just thinking about everything that's coming up." Rowena's smile softened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's natural to feel overwhelmed. This merger, it's important for both our families. Our wedding will solidify everything, not just for us, but for generations." There it was again. Our families, the merger. It was never about them. Everett leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Do you ever think about what you want, Rowena? Outside of what our parents expect?" Her expression didn't falter, though her tone turned sharper. "Of course I do. But we don't have the luxury of selfishness, Everett. People like us have responsibilities. You know that as well as I do." The words hit him like a blow, calculated and precise, just as Rowena intended. She wasn't wrong. Yet, the way she dismissed individuality, as if their lives were nothing more than chess pieces in a corporate game, made his frustration bubble to the surface. "I think I need some time to clear my head," he said, standing abruptly. Rowena blinked, her composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "Everett." "I'll see you later," he interrupted, his voice firm but calm. He dropped a crisp bill on the table and walked out, leaving her sitting there, poised but visibly annoyed. As he stepped into the bustling streets, the cool air felt like a small act of rebellion. For now, he'd escape the weight of it all, even if just for a moment. Marlowe adjusted the collar of her blazer, smoothing the fabric nervously as she stepped into the grand lobby of the Thorn Empire's flagship hotel. The air smelled of fresh lilies and polished wood, a subtle reminder of the establishment's unmatched luxury. She clutched her folder tightly, her resume tucked neatly inside, though she doubted it would carry much weight here. She had come for the position of temporary event organizer, a role she barely qualified for but desperately needed. Rent was looming, and her last paycheck was already spent. A sleek woman at the front desk directed Marlowe to the hiring manager's office. The interview was brief, surprisingly casual, and before she could fully process it, she was hired. The relief was instant but tempered by the knowledge that this job placed her squarely in the orbit of the Thorns, a family whose reputation was both dazzling and foreboding. Her first task came quickly: deliver an updated schedule for an upcoming gala directly to the CEO's office. Marlowe barely had time to glance at the folder handed to her before she was whisked away to the top floor, the elevator doors opening with a quiet chime. The office was sleek and intimidating, the kind of space that whispered power with every carefully placed item. Marlowe hesitated before knocking, her heart racing. "Come in," a deep voice called. She entered to find Everett Thorne seated behind a massive desk. He looked up, his expression briefly registering surprise before settling into polite neutrality. "Schedule update for the gala," Marlowe said, keeping her tone professional. She stepped forward and placed the folder on the desk. Everett studied her for a moment, his gaze curious. "You're new," he said, leaning back slightly. "Yes, just started," she replied, keeping her answers short. There was something about his presence, calm but weighted, that made her hyper-aware of every movement. Still, she forced herself to meet his gaze. "You're not like the usual staff," Everett remarked. There was no malice in his tone, just quiet observation. Marlowe resisted the urge to fidget. "I'm here to do the job. That's all." She turned to leave, but in her haste, she didn't notice the edge of her bag had caught on the desk. A folded piece of paper slipped out, fluttering to the floor. Everett picked it up before she could react. "This is yours?" he asked, glancing at the faded handwriting. "Yes," Marlowe said quickly, snatching it back with more force than intended. "Thank you." As she hurried out of the office, Everett's curiosity lingered. He unfolded his arms and glanced toward the door. The name on the paper, scribbled in pen, wasn't one he recognized, but it intrigued him nonetheless. The morning sun streamed through the wide windows of Everett Thorne's office, but he barely noticed the light as it reflected off the glossy surface of his desk. His focus was on the piece of paper he'd retrieved from the floor during Marlowe's hurried departure. It wasn't like him to invade someone's privacy, but something about her reaction, guarded and almost desperate, had stayed with him. Now, as his gaze scanned the faded ink, he felt a pang of unease. The letter was brief, written in a strong but slightly uneven hand. It spoke of regret, of unfinished business, and a longing to make amends. What caught Everett's attention most was a name buried in the middle of the text, Thorne Industries. Everett frowned, his mind racing. He flipped the paper over, finding no further context, but the implication gnawed at him. The name wasn't a coincidence. Thorne Industries had been his family's foundation long before it evolved into the sprawling empire it was today. He set the letter down, staring at it as if it might suddenly provide answers. A part of him wanted to dismiss it entirely. This wasn't his concern. Yet, curiosity clawed at him, accompanied by a vague sense of guilt. When the clock struck noon, Everett decided he needed answers. He left his office, his steps measured as he descended toward the event staff's workspace. He found Marlowe organizing materials near the hotel's main ballroom. She didn't notice him at first, her focus on sorting name tags into neat rows. "Marlowe," Everett said, his tone even but firm. She looked up, startled but quickly composed herself. "Mr. Thorne, is there something you need?" He held up the folded letter. "I believe this belongs to you." Her expression hardened, a mix of embarrassment and wariness flashing in her eyes. She reached for the paper, but Everett didn't hand it over immediately. "I couldn't help noticing it mentions Thorne Industries," he said carefully. "What's your connection to my family's business?" Marlowe's jaw tightened. "That's personal. I understand. But if there's something I should know—" "It's none of your business," she interrupted, her voice edged with frustration. "That letter is from my father. He's been missing from my life for years, and this was the only clue I had. So, excuse me if I don't want to discuss it." Her words hung in the air, filled with raw emotion. Everett felt a flicker of regret for pressing her, but her defensiveness only deepened his intrigue. "Fair enough," he said, handing the letter back. "But if you ever want to talk, I'm here." Marlowe hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly before she turned back to her work. As Everett walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that her story was just beginning, and that he was already part of it. The hum of the hotel's archives room was the only sound as Marlowe sifted through boxes of old records. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with binders and files marked with faded labels, remnants of Thorne Industries' long history. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but every instinct told her the answer was buried somewhere here, in the layers of a past that didn't belong to her but might hold her father's truth. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened another file, her determination outweighed only by the growing sense of unease. Her father's letters had hinted at involvement with the Thorne Empire, but never specifics. She couldn't shake the image of Coraline Thorne's sharp gaze from the night of the gala, her voice carrying an ominous weight. Whatever her father's connection was, it wasn't simple. "Need help?" The voice startled her, and she spun around, clutching the folder against her chest. Everett stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his presence unmistakably commanding. "I thought I made it clear this was personal," Marlowe said, her voice defensive but steady. Everett stepped closer, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "You did. But I also know when someone's in over their head." She narrowed her eyes. What makes you think that's the case? You're digging through decades-old files without knowing what you're looking for, he replied evenly. And I've spent my life around these records. If there's something about your father here, I might be able to help. Marlowe hesitated, torn between pride and practicality. Finally, she sighed and handed him the file. Fine, but don't think this means I trust you. Everett smirked faintly, flipping through the pages. Duly noted. The two worked in tense silence, the occasional rustle of papers the only sound between them. As the hours passed, Marlowe couldn't help but steal glances at Everett. Despite her reservations, his focus and willingness to help surprised her. Here, Everett said suddenly, pulling out an old photograph. Marlowe leaned closer, her breath catching as she recognized her father. He was younger, standing among a group of sharply dressed men and women at a Thorne Industries gala. Her fingers brushed over the edges of the photo. This proves he was here. He was part of this. Everett's brow furrowed. But why did he leave? And why hasn't anyone mentioned him since? As their eyes met, the tension between them shifted, a mix of shared curiosity and something deeper. We'll find out, Marlowe said firmly, though the questions weighed heavier now than ever. The air in the hotel's private library was still, heavy with the scent of old leather bindings and dust. Marlowe sat at a long mahogany table, her brow furrowed as she flipped through pages of an old ledger. Everett leaned against a nearby bookshelf, arms crossed, his gaze shifting between Marlowe and the room's tall windows, as though expecting someone to burst in. This is risky, Everett said, his voice low but insistent. Marlowe didn't look up. You've said that 3 times in the last hour. I'm starting to think you're the nervous one here. Everett pushed off the bookshelf and walked toward her. You're digging into things my mother wouldn't want anyone to see. That makes it more than just risky. It's dangerous. Marlowe met his gaze, her expression defiant. If my father's name is tied to your family's empire, I deserve to know why. And so do you, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. She was right, of course, but that didn't make this any easier. Everett knew the consequences of uncovering something Coraline wanted buried. He'd seen it before in the way she methodically erased people who crossed her. Their search had been slow and meticulous, moving from archives to personnel files, careful to avoid drawing attention. But Everett could feel the cracks forming. His mother had already noticed his absence during a critical meeting that morning. She hadn't said much, but the way she'd studied him, her lips pressed into a thin line, was enough to set him on edge. And then there was Rowena. She called me twice today, Everett said, breaking the silence. Who? Marlowe asked, still focused on the ledger. Rowena. She knows something's off. Marlowe smirked faintly. Well, she's not wrong. Before Everett could reply, Marlowe stiffened. She placed a finger on the page, tracing a line of handwritten text. Wait, this is it. He leaned over her shoulder to see. The ledger detailed financial transactions from years ago, many of them obscured by vague descriptions. But one entry stood out, tied to a name Marlowe recognized immediately, her father's. Payment for services rendered, she read aloud, her voice shaking slightly. What does that even mean? Everett's eyes narrowed. It means he was involved in something significant. But why hide it? The two exchanged a glance, the weight of the discovery settling over them. Before they could analyze further, Everett's phone buzzed. He checked the screen and saw Coraline's name. Speak of the devil, he muttered. Marlowe's expression turned serious. Answer it. She's probably already suspicious. Everett hesitated before stepping out of the room to take the call. As he disappeared, Marlowe's attention returned to the ledger. Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages, wondering what other secrets were waiting to surface. Meanwhile, Coraline's voice, sharp and clipped, echoed through the phone in Everett's ear. Where are you, Everett? I need you in my office. Now. His grip tightened on the phone. I'll be there soon, he replied, keeping his tone neutral. As he hung up, his unease deepened. Coraline's intuition was sharp, and if she suspected his involvement with Marlowe, she wouldn't hesitate to intervene. When he returned to the library, Marlowe looked up, concern etched across her face. We've got to be more careful, Everett said. My mother's already circling. Marlowe nodded, but her resolve didn't waver. She held up the ledger. Then we'd better move fast. This might be the key to everything. Their search was growing more dangerous, and with every step closer to the truth, the stakes rose higher. The rooftop of the Thorn Empire Hotel offered a breathtaking view of Los Angeles, its skyline a glittering sea of lights stretching into the horizon. The cool night air carried a hint of ocean breeze, refreshing after the long hours spent poring over ledgers and files. Marlowe stood at the edge, her hands resting lightly on the cold metal railing, her eyes fixed on the city below. "It's beautiful," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. Everett, standing a few feet behind her, nodded. "It is. Though sometimes I think it's a little like this hotel, polished and perfect on the surface, but the closer you look, the more cracks you find." Marlowe turned to face him, her expression contemplative. Spoken like someone who knows where all the cracks are. He smiled faintly, stepping closer to join her at the railing. "I've lived in this world my entire life. It's a maze of expectations and obligations, with no room for anything or anyone outside the script." Marlowe glanced at him, her curiosity piqued. "And you don't want that?" Everett hesitated, his gaze dropping to the railing beneath his hands. "I don't know what I want. I just know it's not this." The admission hung in the air between them, unguarded and raw. Marlowe studied him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the weight of something unsaid pressing down on him. "I guess that's one thing we have in common," she said softly. "Feeling trapped." Everett's eyes flicked to hers, surprised. "I don't mean by money or power," she continued, "but by the past, by questions that won't stop haunting you until you find answers." She paused, her voice faltering slightly. "I've spent so much of my life wondering why my father left. If he was trying to protect me, or if I just wasn't enough for him to stay." Her vulnerability hit him harder than he expected. "That's not something a child should ever have to feel," he said, his tone laced with quiet anger on her behalf. "I'm not a child anymore," Marlowe replied, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "But I need to know. Even if it's painful, I have to find out the truth." Everett turned fully toward her, his expression earnest. "You will. I'll make sure of it." The intensity in his voice startled her. For the first time, she saw not just a man bound by duty, but someone willing to defy it. Their eyes locked, and the distance between them seemed to shrink. "I don't know why you're helping me," she said after a moment, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Maybe because I see something in you that I don't see in anyone else," he admitted, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're real, Marlowe. You don't pretend to be anything you're not. And maybe I need a little of that right now." Marlowe's breath caught, and for a fleeting moment, the city lights felt dim compared to the brightness in his gaze. She didn't respond, unsure of what to say, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. The spell was broken by the sound of heels clicking on the rooftop floor. Coraline's sharp voice cut through the quiet. "Everett." They both turned, startled. Coraline stood a few steps away, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of irritation and cold calculation. "Marlowe," she added, her tone clipped, as if the name itself was distasteful. "Mother," Everett began, his voice calm but tinged with annoyance. "We need to talk," Coraline said firmly, her gaze briefly flicking to Marlowe. "Alone." Marlowe hesitated, looking between them. Everett gave her a small nod. "It's fine. I'll catch up with you later." She gave him a wary glance before stepping away, her heart pounding. Coraline waited until Marlowe was out of earshot before turning back to Everett. "You're playing a dangerous game, Everett," she said, her voice low and sharp. "That girl doesn't belong in our world. And maybe I don't either." Everett shot back, surprising himself with the strength in his voice. Coraline's eyes narrowed. "Careful. You have responsibilities, and I won't let you jeopardize everything we've built." Everett didn't respond immediately, his mind still on Marlowe's parting look. For the first time, he wondered if the life his mother had built was something he wanted at all. The dining room of the Thorn estate was as grand as any of their properties. A long mahogany table stretched the length of the room, set with gleaming silverware and crystal glasses that reflected the glow of the chandelier above. Everett sat at one end, his shoulders tense as the evening's conversation unfolded. Coraline Thorne was at her sharpest tonight, her tone calm but laced with subtle authority as she discussed an upcoming merger with the Calders. Rowena sat to her right, nodding in agreement at every well-placed remark, her polished demeanor perfectly suited for the role Coraline envisioned for her. Everett barely touched his plate. His appetite had vanished the moment Coraline began outlining his obligations in the coming weeks. Public appearances, planning meetings, and most gratingly, finalizing his engagement to Rowena. "Everett," Coraline said suddenly, pulling him from his thoughts. Her icy blue eyes locked onto him. "I trust you're prepared for the gala next week. It's an important opportunity to showcase unity between our families." Everett set down his fork, his jaw tightening. Unity or a business transaction disguised as a relationship? Rowena's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but Coraline didn't miss a beat. "Call it what you like, but your role is to ensure its success. This isn't about you, Everett. It's about the future of the Thorne Empire." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "And what if I don't want that future?" The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Coraline's expression remained neutral, but her voice grew colder. "You've always known your responsibilities. This isn't the time for childish rebellion." "I'm not rebelling," Everett said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm questioning whether this life, this constant performance, is even worth it." Coraline's lips thinned, and she took a measured sip of her wine. "You're being selfish." And I can't help but notice this change in attitude coincided with that girl's arrival. Rowena's gaze flicked toward Coraline, her posture stiffening. "I'm sure Everett knows where his priorities lie," she said smoothly, her tone laced with an edge that didn't escape him. Everett clenched his fists under the table but said nothing, unwilling to let the argument escalate further. The rest of the meal passed in strained silence, with Coraline and Rowena resuming polite conversation as if nothing had happened. Later that evening, Everett retreated to his private suite, his thoughts churning. He paced by the windows, staring out at the sprawling city below. A soft knock interrupted his solitude. When he opened the door, Marlowe stood there, her expression a mix of frustration and determination. "Are you avoiding me?" she asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Everett closed the door behind her, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" "You've been distant since last night," she said, crossing her arms. "And I heard Coraline's little comments at dinner. She's made it clear what she thinks of me, and you didn't say a word." "Marlowe, it's not that simple," he began, but she cut him off. "It is that simple," she snapped. "If you know what she's doing is wrong, if you see how toxic this whole charade is, why aren't you standing up to her?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Because it's not just about me. There are people depending on me, people who expect me to keep this family intact. And what about what you want?" Marlowe pressed, her voice softening. "When does that matter?" Everett looked at her, the weight of her words settling over him. He wanted to fight back, to prove he wasn't a pawn in his mother's game, but decades of conditioning weren't easy to shed. "I don't know if I can just walk away," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Marlowe stepped closer, her gaze steady. "You don't have to walk away right now, Everett, but you can start by deciding whose side you're on, hers or yours." Her words lingered as she turned to leave, leaving Everett alone with a choice he couldn't avoid much longer. The room was dimly lit, the glow from Marlowe's laptop casting long shadows on the walls of her small apartment. She sat cross-legged on the floor, the hidden ledger she had smuggled out of the hotel archives open in front of her. Her fingers hovered over the pages, each entry more damning than the last. Transactions labeled as consultation fees were far too large to be legitimate. The names tied to those payments, shell corporations and individuals under investigation for fraud, painted a picture of systematic corruption. Marlowe's stomach churned as she pieced together the trail, the weight of what she discovered pressing down on her. A knock at the door broke her concentration. "Everett," she said, opening the door to find him standing there, his tie loosened and tension etched across his face. "What is it?" he asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Marlowe wordlessly handed him the ledger. Everett frowned as he flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each entry. "This can't be real," he muttered, though the sinking feeling in his chest told him otherwise. "It's real," Marlowe said firmly. "Your family's empire is built on more than hotels and luxury, Everett. It's built on this. Laundering money, bribing officials, covering up scandals." Everett closed the ledger, setting it on the table with a sharp exhale. "You don't understand what exposing this would do." "My mother." "Your mother," Marlowe interrupted, her voice rising, "is at the center of it. She's not just running the show. She's orchestrating every move." He sat down heavily, rubbing his temples. "If this goes public, it won't just destroy her. It'll take the whole company down. Thousands of employees, innocent people, could lose their jobs, and if it doesn't come out," Marlowe countered, "how many more people will get hurt because of what she's doing? How long can you keep protecting her, Everett?" Her words struck a nerve. Everett looked up at her, his jaw tight. "You're asking me to betray my family." "I'm asking you to do the right thing," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension between them. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. Coraline's name flashed on the screen. Everett hesitated, then answered. "Mother, where are you?" Coraline's tone was sharp, her impatience evident. "I'm out," Everett said, his voice guarded. There was a pause on the other end. Then Coraline's voice dropped, cold and cutting. "I know what you've been up to. Whatever you're doing, stop now. This family has survived worse than a little rebellion, Everett, and you don't want to find yourself on the outside." The threat hung in the air long after the call ended. Everett set the phone down slowly, his hands trembling. Marlowe watched him, her expression a mix of concern and resolve. "She knows, doesn't she?" He nodded, his face pale. "She'll cut me off. From the company, from the family, everything, and you're willing to let her keep doing this just to stay in her good graces?" Marlowe asked, her voice laced with urgency. Everett looked at the ledger, then back at her. The weight of his indecision was suffocating, but deep down, he knew Marlowe was right. "I don't know if I can protect you," he said finally, his voice quiet. "I don't need you to protect me," Marlowe replied, stepping closer. "I need you to decide who you want to be." Her words left him staring at the ledger, the choice before him clearer than ever, but no less daunting. Marlowe sat at the corner of a quiet coffee shop, the low murmur of conversations and the hum of an espresso machine filling the air. Across from her sat an older man with a weary face and graying hair, his hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug. "I wasn't sure you'd show up," Marlowe said softly, breaking the silence. The man, a former employee of Thorne Industries named Gerald Moore, gave her a cautious look. "I don't talk about those days often," he admitted, "but you mentioned your father's name, and I couldn't ignore it." She leaned forward, her voice steady but urgent. "What happened to him? Why did he disappear?" Gerald sighed deeply, his gaze dropping to the table. "Your father was one of the good ones. He worked for Thorne Industries back when it was still smaller, more manageable. He started noticing irregularities, money moving to places it shouldn't, deals made in the shadows. He brought it to Coraline's attention, thinking she didn't know. Marlowe's heart sank. But she did know, didn't she? He nodded grimly. She didn't just know. She was orchestrating it. Coraline was already building the empire into what it is today, and she wasn't going to let anyone stand in her way, not even someone as loyal as your father. What did she do to him?" Marlowe asked, her voice tight with emotion. "She blackmailed him," Gerald said bluntly. "She found something from his past. I don't know what exactly, but it was enough to ruin him. She gave him a choice: stay quiet and disappear, or face public disgrace and ruin the life he'd built." Marlowe's hands clenched into fists on the table. "So he chose to leave." Gerald's gaze softened. "He wanted to protect you, Marlowe. He thought disappearing was the only way to keep you safe." Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to nod. "Thank you for telling me." That evening, Everett stood in his mother's expansive office, the skyline of Los Angeles glowing behind her. Coraline sat at her desk, calm and composed as ever, but her piercing gaze was locked on him. "You've been digging into things that don't concern you," she said, her voice sharp but measured. "They concern me more than you think," Everett replied, his tone steady. "I know about the blackmail. I know what you did to Marlowe's father." Coraline's expression didn't waver. "Everything I've done has been for this family. For you." "You keep saying that," Everett said, stepping closer. "But what you've really done is destroy lives for your own ambition. You made people disappear, including Marlowe's father, to protect this empire. That's not strength. It's cruelty." Her jaw tightened, but she held her composure. "You don't understand what it takes to run something of this magnitude, Everett. Sacrifices must be made. Difficult choices must be faced." "Sacrifices?" he repeated, his voice rising. "You're not the one who's sacrificed anything. You've taken from everyone else, robbed them of their lives, their dignity, just so you could sit on top of this empire and call yourself a success." Coraline stood, her calm facade cracking. "Watch your tone. You have no idea the pressures I've faced, the lengths I've gone to protect what we have. Everything you are, everything you have, is because of me." "I don't want any of it," Everett said firmly. The words hung in the air, shocking even himself. Coraline stared at him, her eyes narrowing. "You're a thorn. This is your legacy. You can't just walk away." "I can, and I will," Everett replied. "If staying means condoning everything you've done, then I don't want any part of it." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, perhaps, or recognition that she might be losing her grip on him. "You'll regret this," she said coldly. "The world is not kind to people who turn their backs on power." "Maybe," Everett said, turning toward the door. "But at least I'll be able to look myself in the mirror." As he left her office, a strange sense of relief washed over him. The confrontation wasn't over, but he'd taken the first step toward reclaiming himself. For the first time, he felt like more than just a pawn in his mother's game. The soft glow of a single lamp lit Marlowe's small apartment, casting warm shadows over the mismatched furniture and the stack of books cluttering the coffee table. The faint scent of herbs wafted from the kitchen, mingling with the sound of soft rain tapping against the window. It was a world away from the opulence Everett Thorne had grown up in, but as he sat at the small wooden table, he found a rare sense of peace. Marlowe placed 2 bowls of pasta on the table and took the seat across from him. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and gestured at the simple meal with a sheepish smile. "Not exactly 5-star dining, but it'll do the job," she said. "It's perfect," Everett replied, his voice quieter than usual. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the clink of forks against ceramic. Everett found himself glancing at her more than he should, drawn to the way her guarded determination softened in the quiet moments. Marlowe finally broke the silence, setting her fork down. "You don't have to be here, you know." Everett looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "You've already risked enough. Your family, your future. You don't owe me anything, Everett." He put his fork down, his brow furrowing. "I'm not here because I owe you, Marlowe. I'm here because I want to be." Her gaze dropped, a faint flush coloring her cheeks. "Even if it means losing everything you've ever known?" "Maybe everything I've ever known isn't worth keeping," he said quietly. "I've spent my whole life being the person my mother wanted me to be, making decisions that were never mine to make. But with you," he hesitated, searching for the right words. "With you, I feel like I'm finally doing something that matters. Something real." Marlowe met his gaze, her eyes searching his face. "You mean that?" "I do," Everett said, his voice steady. "I don't know what's going to happen next, but I know I don't want to face it alone. Not without you." Her lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she reached across the table, her hand brushing his. The gesture was tentative, but the warmth of her touch spoke volumes. "I've been so focused on finding answers about my father," she said softly. "I never thought I'd find someone willing to fight alongside me." Everett turned his hand over, letting his fingers intertwine with hers. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." For a moment, the weight of their shared struggles lifted. replaced by something lighter, something that felt almost like hope. Marlowe smiled faintly, her voice gaining strength. Then we fight together. No matter what it takes, no matter the cost. We'll expose the truth. Everett nodded, his grip on her hand tightening. Together, the quiet resolve between them solidified something unspoken. The stakes hadn't changed. If anything, they had grown higher. But they both knew this bond, forged in the fire of adversity, was worth the risk. As the rain continued outside, Everett and Marlowe sat in the glow of the small lamp, united in purpose. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The walls of the Thorne estate's private study seemed to close in as Everett sat across from Rowena Calder. Her usual air of poise and confidence had cracked, replaced by an expression Everett had rarely seen from her: vulnerability. "I know about the ledger," Rowena said, breaking the tense silence. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath the surface. Everett's brow furrowed. "How?" "I overheard Coraline speaking to one of her advisors," Rowena admitted, folding her hands in her lap. "She's more paranoid than ever, Everett. She knows you're digging into her business, and she's preparing to retaliate." Everett leaned back in his chair, studying her. "And why are you telling me this?" "You've always been on her side." Rowena flinched, the accusation cutting deeper than she let on. "I was never on her side. I've just been surviving. My family depends on this merger, Everett. If it falls apart, the Calder name will lose everything." Coraline knew that when she orchestrated this engagement. Everett crossed his arms, his voice calm but sharp. "Then why betray her now?" Rowena hesitated, her polished mask slipping further. "Because I'm tired of being used. Coraline doesn't care about me, about my family, just the power our names bring her. And if you think she'll stop at discrediting you, you're wrong. She'll destroy anyone who threatens her control." Everett studied her, searching for deception, but there was none. For the first time, Rowena looked genuine, stripped of the facade she wore so carefully in public. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice measured. Rowena took a deep breath. "Quietly annul the engagement. I'll support you, help you expose Coraline, but I need to salvage what's left of my family's reputation. A scandal would ruin us." Everett's instinct was to refuse, but he stopped himself. Rowena wasn't wrong. Coraline's influence was vast, and her retaliation would be swift. "Fine," he said reluctantly. "I'll do it. But I need to know you're serious about helping." "I am," Rowena replied, her voice resolute. "Coraline's controlled us for long enough. It's time someone stopped her." Hours later, Coraline paced her office, her sharp heels clicking against the marble floor. The trap was already in motion. "Ensure the press has the story by morning," she said into the phone. "Frame it as embezzlement. Make it clear Marlowe Reed is desperate, using Everett to cover her tracks. I want her credibility destroyed before she has a chance to speak." Coraline's expression hardened as she ended the call. She couldn't allow loose threads to unravel the empire she had built. The conference room on the top floor of the Thorne Empire headquarters loomed like an arena. Its long, polished table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the windows framed the Los Angeles skyline, a testament to the power the family wielded. Marlowe adjusted the strap of her bag, her fingers brushing against the edges of the incriminating ledger tucked safely inside. Everett stood beside her, his suit crisp but his shoulders tense. He glanced at her, his expression a mix of determination and concern. "Are you ready for this?" Marlowe exhaled slowly, meeting his gaze. "As ready as I'll ever be." The weight of what they were about to do pressed heavily on both of them. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a battle for the truth, one that could destroy Coraline's grip on the empire but also put them in her crosshairs. The board members began filing into the room, their conversations a low hum of pleasantries and idle gossip. Marlowe kept her head high, though the sharp gazes from some of them made her feel exposed. She reminded herself why she was there. Her father's truth, her fight for justice. When Coraline entered, the atmosphere shifted. She was the picture of composure, her presence commanding as she moved to the head of the table. Her sharp eyes swept over the room, pausing briefly on Everett and Marlowe. A faint smile played on her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Everett," Coraline said smoothly, her tone tinged with feigned warmth. "I wasn't expecting you to attend today's meeting." And with a guest, Marlowe straightened her posture, refusing to flinch under Coraline's gaze. "I thought it was time the board heard the truth about some of our operations," Everett replied, his voice steady. Coraline arched an eyebrow, her expression cool but calculating. "Truth is such a relative term, don't you think?" The room grew quieter, the tension thickening as the board members exchanged curious glances. Coraline took her seat, folding her hands neatly on the table. "Well," she said, her smile sharpening, "let's proceed. I'm curious to hear what you have to say." Marlowe's grip tightened on her bag. Coraline's tone made it clear she knew more than she let on, and the stakes had just risen. This was no longer just about presenting evidence. It was about surviving the storm that was about to break. The atmosphere in the boardroom was electric, tension rippling through the room as Marlowe and Everett took their places at the far end of the long table. Coraline sat at the head, her hands folded in a display of calm authority, but the flicker of calculation in her eyes betrayed her awareness of the coming storm. Everett glanced at Marlowe, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. Her hands were steady despite the weight of the ledger in her bag, but her heart hammered in her chest. They had prepared for this moment, but facing Coraline's power and the skeptical board members still felt like stepping into a lion's den. "Ladies and gentlemen," Everett began, his voice clear and deliberate, "I called for this meeting today to address serious concerns regarding the integrity of Thorn Industries' operations." Murmurs rippled through the room. Coraline's smile was tight as she interjected smoothly, "I'm sure my son means well, but perhaps he's mistaken the scope of this meeting. We have important financial updates to discuss." Everett didn't waver. "These concerns go beyond routine updates, Mother. They pertain to unethical practices that have been buried for years, practices that have put this company and its reputation at risk." The room fell silent, all eyes on Coraline. Her expression remained neutral, but the tightening of her jaw betrayed her annoyance. "Go on," she said, her voice cold but measured. Everett gestured to Marlowe, who stood and pulled the ledger from her bag. She opened it and laid it on the table, the faded entries glaring under the bright lights. "This ledger contains records of transactions linked to illegal activities, money laundering, bribes, and other unethical dealings," Marlowe said, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "Many of these entries trace directly back to Thorn Industries." Gasps and murmurs erupted around the table as board members leaned forward to examine the evidence. Coraline's expression darkened, but she remained silent, allowing the storm to brew. "Where did you get this?" one board member demanded, his tone skeptical. "It was recovered from company archives," Marlowe replied firmly. "These records were deliberately hidden." Coraline finally spoke, her voice icy. "This is a baseless accusation. Everett, I expected better than to involve an outsider in company affairs." "Baseless?" Everett said, his tone sharp. "You orchestrated these deals, Mother. And when people like Marlowe's father tried to expose the truth, you silenced them." Coraline's mask slipped, anger flashing across her face. "This is absurd. These accusations come from a desperate girl with no proof and no credibility." The room grew tense as Coraline's words hung in the air. Marlowe clenched her fists, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "She's not lying," Rowena said, standing from her seat. All eyes turned to her as she placed a folder on the table. "These are copies of emails and contracts tied to the transactions in that ledger. They confirm everything Marlowe and Everett are saying." The room erupted in chaos, board members demanding answers as Coraline's expression turned into a mask of cold fury. "Rowena," Coraline said, her voice low and dangerous, "what are you doing?" "What I should have done a long time ago," Rowena replied, her voice steady. "You've manipulated us all for your own gain, Coraline. It's time the truth came out." Coraline stood abruptly, slamming her hands on the table. "Do you think this will stop me? That a few papers and accusations will undo everything I've built?" "It's not just papers," Everett said, stepping forward. "It's proof. And this board deserves to know the truth about what kind of empire they're part of." Coraline's eyes narrowed, her gaze piercing into her son. You're a fool, Everett. Everything you have, everything you are, comes from me. And this, she gestured to the room, is how you repay me? By betraying your own mother? Everett's voice didn't waver. This isn't betrayal, mother. It's accountability. Something you seem to have forgotten. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from shock to determination. Finally, one of them spoke. These allegations are serious, he said. I move to launch an immediate investigation into the claims presented. A chorus of agreements followed, and Coraline's icy facade began to crack. You're making a mistake, she hissed, her voice laced with venom. No, Coraline, Everett said, his tone resolute. The mistake was thinking you could keep this hidden forever. As the board moved to act, Coraline's composure shattered. She turned to Everett, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. You've ruined everything. Do you think they'll spare you? You'll lose just as much as I will. Everett met her gaze, unflinching. I'd rather lose everything than keep living a lie. For the first time in his life, he saw something in Coraline's eyes he had never seen before. Fear. It wasn't just the empire that was crumbling around her. It was the realization that she had lost the one person she thought she could always control. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, Everett and Marlowe exchanged a glance, their bond unshaken amidst the turmoil. They had faced the lion in its den, and though the battle wasn't over, they had struck the first decisive blow. The meeting room was a battlefield littered with the aftermath of revelations and shattered reputations. Coraline Thorne sat in silence at the head of the table, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair as the board's decision was finalized. It's unanimous, one of the senior members announced. Effective immediately, Coraline Thorne is suspended from her position as CEO. Pending a full investigation into the allegations, a ripple of murmurs passed through the room, the once unshakable aura of Coraline's dominance replaced with uncertainty and disbelief. For the first time, Coraline looked smaller, her perfectly poised image cracked under the weight of her downfall. Everett remained standing near the center of the room, his expression calm but resolute. The sight of his mother, once the epitome of power and control, now rendered powerless, stirred conflicting emotions within him. But he couldn't dwell on those feelings now. I have something to add, Everett said, his voice carrying through the room. The board members turned their attention to him, the room falling silent once more. While I agree with the board's decision to hold my mother accountable, he began, I've come to a decision of my own. Coraline's eyes snapped to his, her expression hardening. Everett, don't. He ignored her, continuing with steady conviction. I am stepping down from my position within Thorne Industries. Effective immediately. The announcement sent a wave of shock through the room, punctuated by Coraline's sharp intake of breath. You can't be serious, she said, her voice trembling with anger. This company is your legacy, your birthright. Everett turned to her, his gaze unwavering. It's not my legacy. It's yours. And it's built on lies, manipulation, and destruction. That's not a legacy I want to inherit. You think you're better than this? Coraline snapped, rising to her feet. Walking away doesn't absolve you of responsibility. Everything you have, everything you are, is because of me? No, Everett replied, his voice calm but firm. Everything I am is despite you. The weight of his words hung in the air, silencing even Coraline's retort. She sank back into her chair, her face pale, her grip on the armrests tightening as if holding on to the last remnants of her power. Turning to the board, Everett continued, I leave this company in your hands. I trust you'll rebuild it into something honorable. But as for me, I'm done living under this shadow. Outside the meeting room, Marlowe waited in the hallway, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her bag. She had insisted on giving Everett the space to face his family and the board, but the uncertainty of what was unfolding behind the closed doors had her heart racing. When the doors finally opened, Everett stepped out, his expression unreadable at first. How did it go? She asked cautiously. It's over, he said simply, his voice steady. She's out and I've stepped away. Marlowe's eyes widened. You stepped down? He nodded, a small, tired smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It was never mine to begin with, and I've realized I don't need it to define who I am. Marlowe searched his face, seeing not regret but relief. She reached out, her hand finding his. So, what now? Now, Everett said, lacing his fingers with hers, we start fresh. Together. They walked down the hallway, leaving behind the echoes of the corporate empire that had dictated Everett's life for so long. The weight of his decision was heavy, but the freedom that came with it was exhilarating. Later that evening, the two of them sat on the balcony of Marlowe's modest apartment, a stark contrast to the grandeur of the Thorne estate. The city lights stretched out before them, a reminder of the vast world that lay ahead. What happens to your mother now? Marlowe asked softly. Everett leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. She'll fight the investigation, try to claw her way back. But without the board's support and with the evidence against her, she won't get far. Marlowe nodded, her eyes drifting to the skyline. Do you think she'll ever try to make amends? He shook his head. Coraline doesn't know how to admit fault. She'll always see herself as the victim. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. I used to think that walking away would feel like failure, Everett said after a while. But now, it feels like the first real decision I've ever made. Marlowe smiled, turning to him. And it was the right one. For you, and for the people she hurt. He reached over, taking her hand in his. None of this would have happened without you. You showed me what it means to fight for something real. Marlowe's smile softened, her fingers tightening around his. We fought together, and we'll keep fighting, no matter what comes next. As the night deepened, they sat side by side, the weight of the past slowly giving way to the promise of the future. For Everett, the sacrifice was great, but the triumph wasn't just in exposing the truth. It was in reclaiming his life and finding something worth holding on to, someone worth fighting for. The sun filtered through the large, glass storefront of their new business, casting warm light onto the freshly painted walls and rows of wooden shelves. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the earthy aroma of potted plants arranged throughout the space. A small chalkboard near the door read, "Welcome to Haven, a place for community, connection, and growth." Marlowe stood behind the counter, carefully arranging a display of locally made goods. Jars of honey, handmade candles, and small art prints filled the space, each item chosen to reflect the values she and Everett wanted to champion: sustainability, collaboration, and supporting the people around them. Everett walked in from the back, carrying a stack of receipts and a slightly frazzled look. I never thought keeping track of expenses could be this complicated, he said, dropping the papers onto the counter with a sigh. Marlowe smiled, looking up from her work. Welcome to the world of small business ownership. It's not quite as glamorous as running an empire, is it? He chuckled, running a hand through his hair. Not glamorous, but it's ours. That's what matters. She set down the display and leaned against the counter, watching him. His suit and tie had been replaced by rolled-up sleeves and a relaxed demeanor. He looked freer than she'd ever seen him, and it made her chest swell with pride. Do you miss it? She asked softly, tilting her head. He didn't need clarification to know what she meant. He considered the question for a moment before shaking his head. I thought I would. But the truth is, I've never felt more at peace. Walking away was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the best decision I've ever made. Marlowe reached out, touching his hand. You've built something real now, something you can be proud of. Everett's eyes softened as he looked at her. We've built something real. I couldn't have done this without you, Marlowe. They shared a quiet smile, the kind that spoke of mutual understanding and gratitude. Later that day, the doors of Haven opened to their first customers. A steady stream of neighbors, artists, and curious passers-by filled the space, their presence turning the once-empty store into a lively hub of activity. An older woman browsed the shelves of handmade crafts, pausing to compliment Marlowe on the store's warmth and charm. A young musician sat up in the corner to play acoustic guitar, his melodies adding a serene backdrop to the bustling atmosphere. Everett moved through the space, chatting with customers and refilling coffee cups, a natural ease in his interactions. The sharp, corporate facade he once wore had melted away, replaced by a genuine desire to connect with people. As the day wound down, Marlowe and Everett sat at one of the small cafe tables near the front, sharing a quiet moment. "It's not perfect," Marlowe said, glancing around the room, "but it's ours." Everett leaned back, a contented smile on his face. "It's more than I ever thought I could have." She tilted her head, studying him. "Do you ever think about what your mother would say if she saw you now?" He laughed, shaking his head. "I'm sure she'd have plenty to say. None of it complimentary." They both laughed softly, but there was a lingering solemnity in the air. The cost of their choices had been high. Everett's relationship with his mother was fractured, possibly beyond repair, and Marlowe still carried the ache of unanswered questions about her father. But the weight of those sacrifices was lighter now, tempered by the life they were building together. "What about you?" Everett asked, his tone thoughtful. "Do you think this is what your father would have wanted for you?" Marlowe considered the question, her gaze drifting to the customers still milling about the shop. "I think he would have wanted me to find my own way, to build something meaningful, something that lasts. And I think I'm finally doing that." Everett reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "We both are." As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light through the storefront, they sat hand in hand, surrounded by the quiet hum of their new beginning. They had traded a life of opulence and power for one of simplicity and purpose, and though the road ahead was uncertain, they were ready to face it together. The soft rustling of paper broke the stillness in the room. Marlowe sat cross-legged on the floor of her apartment, the last letter from her father resting in her lap. The faded envelope had arrived unexpectedly earlier that day, postmarked from a faraway city she didn't recognize. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the letter, the handwriting unmistakably his. Everett sat nearby on the couch, quietly watching her. He didn't interrupt, sensing the weight of the moment, but his presence was grounding, a steady anchor as Marlowe confronted the emotions swirling within her. She took a deep breath and began to read aloud, her voice soft but steady. "My dearest Marlowe, if you're reading this, it means you've found your way to the truth. For that, I am so proud of you. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't regret the choices I made. I left not because I didn't love you, but because I loved you too much to let my mistakes ruin your life. I thought disappearing would shield you from the fallout, but now I see that leaving you created a different kind of wound. You've always been strong, Marlowe, stronger than I ever was. That strength has carried you through so much already, and it will guide you wherever you choose to go. I've spent these years watching from afar, hoping you would find your way, even if I couldn't be there to see it. And now I'm writing this to tell you one thing. Live boldly. Don't let fear hold you back. Don't let the past define who you are. You have a bright, beautiful life ahead of you, and you deserve to live it fully without regret. Whatever path you choose, know that I am with you, always. You are my greatest pride, Marlowe. Thank you for being my light, even when I didn't deserve it. With all my love, Dad." Marlowe's voice faltered on the last word, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. She set the letter down gently, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her face. Everett moved to sit beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "He wanted you to know how much you meant to him," he said softly. "That's what matters." Marlowe leaned into him, the warmth of his embrace offering comfort as she let the weight of her father's words settle over her. For so long, she had been chasing answers, clinging to the hope that uncovering the truth would bring her peace. Now, she realized it wasn't about the answers. It was about finding the strength to move forward. "I think I'm ready," she said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. Everett tilted his head, watching her. "Ready for what?" "To let go," she replied, her gaze lifting to meet his. "To stop looking back and start focusing on what's ahead." He smiled, his thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. "Then let's do it. Together." The two of them stepped onto the small balcony as the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. The city below was quiet, still waking from its slumber, and the air was cool and crisp. Marlowe leaned against the railing, her face tilted toward the horizon. "Do you think it'll always feel this uncertain?" Everett stepped beside her, his hand finding hers. Probably, he admitted. But uncertainty isn't always a bad thing. It just means anything is possible. She turned to him, a soft smile playing on her lips. Anything? He nodded. Anything. As the sun rose higher, its golden light washing over them, Marlowe felt a sense of calm she hadn't known in years. The path ahead was uncharted, but for the first time, it didn't feel daunting. It felt full of possibility. "I think we're going to be okay," she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. Everett squeezed her hand, his smile matching hers. "I know we are." Together, they watched the new day begin, hopeful for the future and ready to face it side by side.